Shalom and welcome to What Are We Saying When We're Praying? It's a look at some of the most beloved prayers in our liturgy, both on Shabbat and on weekdays, with an eye towards understanding what they're all about. Not everyone understands the Hebrew, and even if we read translation, if you pick up several different Siddurim prayer books, you'll see that there are several different translations. Each one has its own agenda, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have any better understanding of the prayer than before. So what I'd like to look at today is a section of our morning service called Kriyat Shema Uvirchoteha, the recitation of Shema Yisrael and Her Blessings. There are, in the morning service, two blessings before the verses from Deuteronomy that make up the Shema, and one blessing afterwards. And this structure of the three blessings represents the historical progression from creation to revelation to redemption. Now, God is the creator of the universe and everything within it. By acknowledging the daily renewal of creation, we affirm God's continued role in creation. And in fact, every morning when we wake up, we are creating the day anew. So the first blessing, the first bracha, is Yotzer, creation. And the formation of the world in the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, the idea of the ongoing process of creation is understood in the Yotzer Or, meaning the one who creates light, which declares that God, through his goodness, daily renews the work of creation. This first blessing acknowledges not only creation as a whole, but specifically the creation of two kinds of light. The physical light from the celestial bodies, which were created on the fourth day, and the spiritual light created on the first, when God said, Yehi Or, let there be light. A passage called the Kedushat Yotzer, the sanctification of creation, tells of the heavenly beings who together, in chorus and responsively, acclaim God's greatness and sovereignty. In the Amida, the standing prayer, assuming there's a minyan, this prayer is said standing by the congregation. Here, in the Kedushat Yotzer, we're either describing what the angels are saying, or perhaps telling them what to say. This universal blessing gives way to a more particularistic blessing, Ahava, or love, which speaks of God's love for the people Israel. Now, there's a dispute recorded in the Talmud in Brachot 11b regarding the appropriate wording for the opening phrase of this tefillah. It begins in the morning, Ahava Rabbah Ahavtanu, with abounding love you have loved us, O Lord our God, and concludes with, Praised be you, O Lord our God, who chooses the people Israel in love. Choosing in love is the covenant at Sinai described in Exodus 9:23, the singling out of Israel of all the nations to enjoy the intimate protection of God in exchange for adherence to divine commandments and obligations. This second blessing moves us to the next theological stepping stone, to God as the parent and the teacher of Vinu and Moreh, who established a special relationship with us by giving us the Torah. God's choice of Israel for this role was an act of pure and everlasting love, not the result of any superior quality on Israel's part. This theme runs through the entire blessing, God's love for the world and God's special love for Israel, reciprocated by Israel's love for God and Torah. Next, we have Torah, or revelation. The giving of the Torah at Sinai in Exodus is reenacted with the recitation of three passages. The first is from Deuteronomy 6:4-9, the next 11:13-21, and the last, the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, 15:37-41. The third blessing is Geulah, redemption. And God here is presented as the redeemer or protector of the community that keeps faith with the Torah. Now, the great archetypal instance of divine intervention is the liberation from Egypt. And it's the recollection of that event that is the main subject of the prayer, which says, Mimitzrayim ga'altenu, from Egypt you redeemed us, O Lord our God, and from the house of bondage you delivered us. This liberation from Egypt is the basis for a future redemption. Now, the blessing immediately after the Shema, both in the morning and the evening service, acknowledges God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt and quotes Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, which Moses sang. And you can find that in chapter 15 of the book of Exodus. The expression that ends this prayer, Tzur Yisrael, Rock of Israel, is a reference to God in the last paragraph that's said in the morning and taken from Isaiah chapter 30, verse 29. The same phrase was incorporated into the State of Israel's Declaration of Independence signed on May 14, 1948. With trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures in testimony to this declaration. Now, the Talmud teaches that this blessing should be said immediately before the Amidah in order to join the two. One reason is to connect the theme of Israel's redemption in the past, that's reflected in the Shema and in the blessing, with the theme of Israel's redemption of the future, which is recited in the Amidah, who will bring a Redeemer with love to their children's children for God's name's sake. Now, the Shema is the first topic in the Mishnah, and there's an assumption that people know it and that it should be repeated twice a day. It emphasizes Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, our acceptance of the sovereignty of heavens. It's important for us to understand the structure. It's important for us to understand that we pray both for the welfare of all, the welfare of the state of Israel, and for ourselves. And we pray that just as God brought us out of the land of Egypt from slavery and delivered us to freedom and ultimately to the promised land, we pray that God will continue to help those who are enslaved to become free.